Dear viewers, welcome back to the podcast of the State of Affairs. We have been powering a lot of debates around international relations, foreign policy, politics, domestic and international geopolitics. That's quite lovely and quite interesting about the State of Affairs. I have been inviting lots of people, lots of great scholars, researchers, and whatnot. Today, I'm being joined by someone who is the CEO and the founder of Astrid Research and Advisory Services Private Limited, and we'll be talking at the outset about the global education scenario in light with the new trends that are in the town and in the market, and also based on the pure research that's being conducted by my guest. She's Aparajita Banerjee, and I am quite amazed and I am quite overwhelmed by the fact that she is on the podcast. Welcome to the conversation, Aparajita.
Thank you, Mehraj. Thanks to the team of State of Affairs for organizing this podcast and actually concentrating on the education system. I know it's a little bit of a diversion from your usual podcast, which are purely focused on geopolitics and etc. But this is nevertheless a very important topic and very topical to discuss at this point, especially with the changes taking place in the Indian education system and how it's aligned to the global trends, as you've just mentioned. So at the outset, and this is for the convenience of our viewers as well, I'd like to talk briefly about the summary, since we are referring to the research that we did conduct during April this year at the Bengal Global Trade Expo Careers Counseling Week, and it was written up in August. So just give them a little bit of an idea as to why this came about and what's the important aspect that we should really be talking about at this stage. So delve right deep into it. The title of the report is Assessment of Student Response Agency Perceived Competence and Engagement with the Indian Education System in Eastern India, and the relevance of upskilling based on NEP 2022. Now, we all know that the Indian education system has been significantly impacted by the pandemic, as have other industries, in the last 2 years. And this has prompted government officials, policymakers, academics, and the society at large to reevaluate the normalized approach and quality of learning methods of India and reassess its relevance globally with the changing trends in the workforce. Now, the national education policy has been pivotal in emphasizing the need for Indian education to transform into a more progressive, holistic, inclusive, and multidisciplinary and integrated framework that gradually adopts a more engaging and effective approach to the teaching and learning method, as opposed to the traditionalist silo and rote learning approach that I think students over here are more accustomed to, or have been more accustomed to traditionally, or for the past couple of years. The purpose of this investigation was to assess secondary and tertiary student response, agency, perceived competence, and engagement with the current education system in Eastern India. So obviously we're focusing on Eastern India because that's where I got the data from. And this would further indicate whether additional upskilling in complementary fields such as management would be required to achieve the objectives of NEP. So we'll go and discuss about what is the NEP and what about the functionalities of NEP in a while. But this report was an outcome of the insights and discussions documented during the Bengal Global Trade Expo Careers Counselor Week in April of this year. And it was more of an exploratory research. So if you want to know the methodology behind it, I think we should share that, because that's going to be easier for the audience to explain why we chose the factors that we did. Questionnaires were administered to a total of 60 students. I am aware that that's not a very big sample size, but we did with what we got, and we tried to come up, we pretty much, that would be the starting point of this phase. And the questionnaires consist of 13 questions divided into two distinct parts. Part A consisted of 4 descriptive questions that explored student response and agency, and aimed at understanding their experience with the current educational system. Part B consisted of 9 multiple choice questions and looked into the perceived competency of the students, and how they engage with their current educational experience, and also their orientation towards future career objectives. Because we are talking about whether upskilling would be relevant at this point in time. Findings from Part A were categorized as emerging themes because of the descriptive nature of their the Part A questions, and percentages were calculated from Part B because we used a Likert scale for the multiple choice questions. That's the way we went about it. Now, results indicate that a significant number of students had issues, unfortunately, with engaging with the current educational programs. They lacked awareness of career opportunities available to them, were not studying the subjects of their choice, and were really keen on gaining additional skill sets. Findings from Part B indicated that students would significantly benefit from exposure to various management focus areas, and that would increase the breadth and depth of their academic grounding, which would prepare them for the changing workforce post-pandemic. Now, these findings do suggest that the NEP, and as we're discussing the Indian education system and its trends and how it's aligning to the global trends, they would benefit from moving from a more teacher-centric prescriptive method of learning to one that is more student-centric and allow students to become more responsive, flexible, and engaged with their educational system. So that was a summary.
And I would like to know more about this thing, that the entire research was conducted before the national education policy or after that? How long was it? I mean, before the national education policy or after that?
It was after that because we looked into a particular paper, which I'll be discussing briefly as well, done by Shukla et al. And we can use this as a case study that formed the basis of our investigation. This was done in Amity University, but at the beginning of this year. So I think the dialogue started sometime during COVID or perhaps towards the end of 2022. And then committees were formed, and there were still discussions, roundtable meetings, etc., on how to implement it. So it was all happening concurrently.
And about what this thing, that once we are done with this part of the data sample that you have collected over the time about the education scenario prevailing in the East India, especially. I mean, down the line, if we talk about national education policy, how well synchronized it is with global trends. I mean, how well has it addressed the discrepancies of the conventional education policy and the systems that be there?
From the eastern part of India, as far as I'm aware, I was just reading an article today that as of 2022 November, this was in the Millennium Post, that there has been a committee that has been formed, and they have taken various insights into account, created a committee, and they are in tandem, in sync with what's happening at the national level. Now, from my understanding, I think the different states, the state education policy of various states would come together in consensus, and then that would pretty much put forward a format for the national education to be implemented based on certain trends in the state. So maybe West Bengal or eastern part of India may have certain elements that may be tweaked as opposed to perhaps Uttar Pradesh. And it all depends on which states started acting on their, this education policy at what point in time. So that would mean that, Uttar Pradesh and Amity University that conducted their study in the beginning of this year, they had already formed a model focus group discussion. And they're already at the first phase, whereas Eastern India sorted things out towards the end of this year. So I think the aim, and Delhi was probably way ahead because that's where the national dialogue was taking place. So I think we're looking at 2024 to 25, where all of these things are going to be pulled together for a national implementable plan to come about.
And also, what about this thing that if we have to count the entire features, you might have gone through the national education policy document and the draft itself. And if we have to count the features of it, because you have researched well on the topic, So you can just help me count all the features for the larger audience and for me especially to understand how technically sound it is and how accurate and precise it's about the discrepancies of the older education policy in India.
Well, I mean, this particular research has not really dealt with the technicalities. I understand when you're talking about the technicalities, you're probably being on about the 5+3+3+4 segment and how they've been divided based on the development phases of their particular grades. But that was not the focus of my study. My focus was more towards the functionality of NEP, because the time when Astrid was conducting this particular research on ground, there weren't or there had not been any particular field investigations done from the eastern part of India. So I think our study focuses more on whether upskilling, which would be one of the strategies that the NAP would ultimately, kind of go towards to sync with the needs of the global trends. So the study that we did was more towards the functionality of NEP, and we tried to unpack the factors that need to be taken into consideration by policymakers and educationists while attempting to revamp the educational system. So it was more like what was it that the policymakers are trying to move from and towards. So what was the issue with the traditionalist learning method, and where did the conversation start from? Why did we choose to go towards a more progressive learning style? What does that exactly mean? So these were the focus of my research, more than looking at the structural aspect.
There's also a debate that's going around in the country in India. I mean, most of the intellectuals and the class that was much more, asking for the reforms in the education policy.
Mhm.
And as somebody like Aparajita, who has a keen interest into the entire segment of education, how well will you be able to define the entire national education policy document as an academician?
I would, I mean, there's a lot of checks and balances that need to be put in place before we can see the whole document. I mean, I'm sure that there are conversations going on about how it could be better revamped in terms of, like, the latest thing would be whether it's a good idea to have the language discrepancies around, like, where you can start learning in your mother tongue on your, with the +5, and then you can shift. So I don't think at this stage I'm at a stage where I can comment overarchingly or holistically, but I would like to concentrate more on what was the reason why this conversation was started. Like, why did we come about to move from the traditionalist approach to a progressive style of learning, and more toward the psychological aspect, Mehraj, because one thing that our study did do differently was ask the students. I mean, all the discussions that have been taking place so far have been centered around academics, policymakers. But in terms of when you're talking about the factors that define progressive learning, such as the ones that we're talking about in our research, which is agency and perceived competence, I believe that, and I hope that further, investigation or surveys would take the students' perspective into account, because we are catering to their competency at the end of the day. I mean, how would you move from a teacher-centric approach of learning style to one that is student-centric without understanding how the students feel about their education at present? It doesn't make sense. So,
There is also something, Aparajita, I'd like to intervene here because since India has the G20 presidency presently, it also has a greater global influence when it comes to geopolitical setting of the world. And greater convergence of interests with the countries to the east and to the west of the country. And there are global trends that actually necessitate that there have to be an education system that's in sync with the global demands. And if you as an academician will be asked to to comment on this thing, that how well the national education policy is representative of the dictum that it actually addresses the market and the market also, and also the elements and the demands that we can say at the global level, and the trends that are actually that the trends that actually represent the global demand for having an education system or a setup that can help the people and help the students to absorb and make career out of it.
So let's start off by identifying the factors that underpin progressive and concept-based learning style that India is gradually moving towards. Since you are talking about the global trends, one thing that the workforce and the employers are looking out for, it's not only the grades, the first thing is that they are looking for integrated and progressive style and concept-based learning. And that is a trend globally, but what does that exactly mean? So let's try and unpack that to answer your question, if I may. So obviously there has been a sea change in the overall perceptions of progressive education in India, with an emphasis, mind you, on concept-based learning that the NEP puts forward. Now, the NEP has consistently maintained that in order to cope with the complex, interconnected, and international workforce post-pandemic, it is crucial for students to integrate their academic and professional fields with analytics, management, policy, and any other field that would highlight a holistic problem-solving mindset that is required to navigate the career challenges in the post-pandemic era. But however, there's one thing that we have to look into as well, that besides trying to revamp the education system in one that students would not only study science, STEM, but they would also have management infused in it, analytics, because obviously we cannot do without the data boom. Even when you're studying policy, it's important that you have a fundamental understanding of statistics in order to make sense of the policy. In contrast, or additionally, when you're studying statistics, it's important for you to understand, for example, geopolitical issues or management, because then you wouldn't be able to make sense of the data that you're retrieving. So it's important to have that fusion or the integration. But integrated academic learning is meant to provide students with the opportunity to respond to real life scenarios and learn from experts in the field. So Indian educators, as we're discussing right now, have been very enthusiastic about practical and applied learning approaches in line with the global trends, intended to add value to the student experience beyond the traditional and theoretical approach that typically confines the student into a prescriptive syllabus. So they're trying to move away from this whole traditional learning style that usually instructs the student on what to think and commands them to do as told. In contrast, when we're talking about the progressive or concept-based learning, the style gives students the freedom to explore their own ways of approaching a problem, right? In other words, the idea would be to give them the psychological space to reflect on how to think and to hone into their creative skills and understand how to learn by doing. So that's one fundamental difference that I don't think the rote learning approach has been capable of delivering to the students. Now, at this point in the discussion, it would be helpful to delve a little bit deeper, right, into the factors that make for a progressive or concept-based learning framework. So essentially what we're looking at is how does the Western education, or maybe let's not use Western education, but maybe education in a more progressive manner, and the innovative styles of education differ from that of the Indian one. And how, and basically what are the enablers of progressive learning that ought to be considered while aiming to implement the NEP? So what is it, what is progressive lifestyle learning apart from the structural aspect? What does it entail? The first thing that our research has discussed was agency. Why is it important at this stage? And this is where culture comes in as well, Mehraj. So the studies by OECD in 2019 and 2021 attributed student agency as being one of the most crucial aspects in a student's response to their learning style in higher education. So it has been observed that students who play an active and conscious role in what and how they learn end up responding positively to their academic programs and the learning experience. Now, agency is defined as a student's inherent ability to intentionally, purposefully, and meaningfully connect with their learning experience and be conscious of what they're learning and derive value from the learning experience overall. So it's not like that students are there because they just have to be there and they're forced to be there. They're very conscious that there are reasons why they're there and how they can get the maximum benefit of connecting with that particular subject or that challenge. So in other words, agency as defined by Jaskela et al. 2021 emphasizes that awareness and intrinsic motivation are key factors that assist the students to essentially learn regarding how to learn. So what we're doing over here, and these are one of the main aspects that differentiates, the progressive trend of education versus the traditionalist, is the metacognition behind thoughts. You're not going there like just learning. You're learning how to approach a problem, and you're learning how to learn. So that's literally like unlearning what you've done all this while and going on to a new framework where you just start learning how to learn. And that's what NEP essentially is addressing at its fundamental level. So although agency is exercised in moral, economic, social, and creative context, however, it is primarily constructed through foundational cognitive, social, and emotional skills that allow students to overcome motivational deficits, right? So this is something that our research looked into. And we, as I mentioned before, we wanted to find out what was the issue with the students of Eastern India and why did they feel so demotivated while in class, or why were they just so, like disinterested and not very engaged with their academic pathway. The second factor impacting progressive and concept-based learning style is a student's perceived competence about their ability to tackle new challenges head on. Why is this important? Because in a rote learning educational style, usually the concept is that you're being you're being like spoon fed. That's a term we use in India a lot, right? We'll show you what to do. This is how you're going to be doing it. So, but that does not really create for a situation where you're developing your confidence and your competence, which is very important for a student to engage with this progressive style of learning. Recent studies by the World Economic Forum, so recent as 2022 or 2020 as well, have claimed that apart from critical thinking and problem solving being highly desired traits sought after by employers in the post-pandemic era, the new workforce and employers emphasize their preference for self-aware employees. So this is the difference. Answering your question, has India been able to identify what is it that the global employers are looking towards? So it's not the grades that we're so used to and cracking JEEs and IITs and etc., but it's more about being self-aware employees. And why is that important? Because self-aware employees are perceived to have more resilience, curiosity, flexibility, consciousness and conscientiousness, and effective coping mechanisms during stressful situations. These changes in employer preferences internationally in the post-pandemic indicate that academic performance alone is not sufficient to successfully navigate through the job markets. Now, from an employer's perspective, as outlined by the World Economic Forum, they tend to believe that self-aware employees have engaged with their education in a holistic manner. So when you're out of that, IIT or whatever is your alumni or school of training, you appear to be more self-aware, and that's visible while you're at work in a realistic, in a real life scenario. And employers have engaged with their education in a holistic manner, whereby they also have developed certain personality traits that have helped them to successfully transition into the workforce. At this point, we can say that whatever's been taught or has been taught traditionally in our syllabus, perhaps there's a disconnect between what is required in the real life and what has been taught so far. Studies by Kremer et al. And Schmidt et al., this is from 2012 and 2015, attributed perceived competence in improving student academic engagement and being essential in the development of self-awareness, resilience, curiosity, and motivation towards learning. So the traits which are, highly desirable by the 21st century employers of now and post-pandemic era. Perceived competence essentially encourages people to develop new skills based on intrinsic self-determination, to take on new challenges and psychologically persist during accomplishing a task and feel more confident after having surmounted that. So it's an important factor in creating an educational environment that makes students feel more competent uh, to overcome challenging tasks in order to build student confidence. So which means that in the future, when they're put, when they're put in front of difficult, different, and unfamiliar situations, it's their perceived competence that will allow them to be more, like focused and fearless about the task that's in front of them. And these build your character, ultimately, which assists you and facilitates your transition into the workforce. So in our study, we have addressed the student perceptions on certain skill sets, such as communication. Some people find it very difficult to communicate. That is obviously a very desired skill set in the 21st century, goes without saying. Interpersonal skills, something that has also been noted by the NEP besides STEM, known as the soft skills range. Conflict resolution, innovation, collaboration. And in our studies, we have aligned them to management focus areas intended to upskill where they perceive to be a lack of competence in that particular area. So that's what our study has focused on. And the results were actually quite revealing, because when you're looking at agency, as to with how consciously you are and willingly how you're engaging with your particular subject, more than half of basically 36 students, I remember, they were not studying a subject of their choice. Now that is setting the road towards ultimate disaster in the future. I mean, from the beginning, if you're forced to take on subjects that you don't enjoy, I mean, that's going to really have detrimental impacts on your association with your academic experience. And with the perceived competence part, there were so many students that really wanted to get upskilled in collaboration. They were very curious about, well, then how do we upskill ourselves in this particular skill set of collaboration? Because according to obviously the workforce, it's something that's required. When you're talking about international relations or even management, you have to know how to collaborate with your peers at a maybe postgrad level, and then later on when you're working, it's a very important skill. But it just seems like when you're going through a rigorous traditionalist approach in your education, you don't find challenges or tasks that really kind of assist you in skills to develop your collaborative capabilities.
Aparajita, the entire research findings that you have actually done reveals the basic fundamental thing that okay, there is something terribly wrong with the older policy that we have at work, given the reason that the findings itself, the statistical data itself reveals the fact that okay, you haven't made change, you have just not created a culture around education so that students or the people who actually want to get educated have to be too much into it, not out of the force, not out of the compulsion. And the agency thing that you mentioned, it was quite interesting, and I'd like to have your views on the particular segment of this conversation, and we'll be wrapping this thing entirely after this. Is that the global demands, if we have to match up with the global trends in education and the education market that we are going to have, and the students who are looking for career choices in this 21st century, what will be the things that actually Indians and students especially have to look up to once they get to a point in their life, in their career, where they have to get absorbed in the market?
That's a pretty big question. But just focusing on what do they have to look up to? First of all, I think at a very cultural level, they have to change their optics around how they're approaching education. Because we're talking about something that's very fundamentally steeped in our culture. For example, can you start by teaching and maybe supporting students to ask questions in class, so that once they go into the workforce, they can be, they can be able to contribute more effectively during their group meetings. Can you ask students to, or could it be possible to sort of students to think outside the box sometimes and to accept the more unconventional forms of solutions without feeling the pressure to conform? So these are certain things that I feel would be important for the Indian education system to address. But more practically, I mean, again, we're going into the depth of things. That's why I believe that upskilling, because it's not possible to completely, have a 180-degree turnaround of events within a span of 2 years. And that's us asking for too much. It's a bit too optimistic. But nevertheless, what we could do practically is have these upskilling courses parallelly run alongside with their training programs or education programs, where they get a feel and understanding of what else is out there, what other career opportunities are out there. For example, in international relations, if somebody wants to go into, I don't know, international security or something. I remember that there was a very interesting conference related to that, and students got an overview of, okay, this is also a career that exists. Health management. So having that awareness is very important, and I think that's a practical way to start off this whole kind of implementation plan of NEP.